very pleased to have Barb Flynn with me today. Barb is both a recently passed editor of the Journal of Supply Chain Management and one of the most distinguished scholars in our domain. And she has willingly and graciously offered to talk a little bit about some of her own research that she thinks might be worth replicating. So I asked Barb three questions ahead of time. The first question was, what paper would you replicate? And then the second and probably linked question is why?
Okay, thanks, Mark. So first of all, I was really excited to hear about this direction of encouraging replications. I think replications are a really important part of science, of advancing science, and also a way of hopefully giving the original article more credibility if you show that it can be replicated by others. So I'm very happy to participate in this. So the article that I selected was one that was published in 2010 on the relationship between supply chain integration and performance in China. The reason I selected it was I just went through and looked at citations. I went to Google Scholar, and this is the most cited of the articles that I've been an author on. So I thought this is one that is fairly well known, and it would be an interesting one to talk about. At the time that we did it, one of the things that was perhaps a little unique about it was that we included internal integration as well as upstream and downstream integration. It was done with managers in China, which is more common now. And we used two different approaches, both a contingency and configuration approach. So we had two different sets of theory, two different types of analysis. So kind of interesting in that regard. So that was the article that I chose, and a little bit about what the article's about and why I selected it.
Why, when it comes to replicating it though, there's something about it that you're not sure about, or if you prefer to put a more positive spin on that, how would you see a replication of this? Would it be in a different context? Would it be with different measures, something of that nature?
Yeah, thanks. And it was a lot of fun thinking about this. So I think there are a number of different things that could be done in a replication. The first would be to do a pure replication and try to, do exactly what we did in the same context, same method. And I'm not sure that's always a good thing to do, but I think in the case of this article, it would be. This was based on data that was collected for the PhD dissertation of one of the authors. And I'm not sure when that was, but I think it was 2005 or maybe even a little bit earlier. So it was quite a while ago when the data was collected, even quite a while before when it was published. And when you think about what's going on in China, economic conditions and supply chain conditions have just changed dramatically during that time period. So I think it would be interesting to go back and try to replicate it exactly as we had done it, and see if things remained the same. Probably more interesting is what would we vary without really changing the essence of the study. So I guess first of all, I would keep the approach and the theory the same, the contingency and configuration approach. I think that is one of the strengths of the article, and it's interesting because it's looking at the same problem in two different ways. So I think that would be important to keep. I would also keep the same measurement scales. I think that's really important in a replication. If they're rewritten, you're not really necessarily measuring exactly the same thing. And we used measures that had been previously validated by other authors, both in marketing and in supply chain. So I would keep the same measures. As far as other things, most of the changes that I would make would be in the sampling, and I think there's a lot of interesting things that could be accomplished there. One thing, we sampled 5 cities in China because it's a big country, and we looked at cities that were in different stages of economic development, all the way from Chongqing, which was just really getting started in its economic development at one extreme, and Shanghai and Hong Kong at the other, which are very highly developed. So it was this selective sampling in 5 cities. I think a broader representation of manufacturing and supply chains in China would be good in a replication, maybe something more nationwide. You could still control for different stages of economic development, or maybe do it in just cities that were at a comparable level of economic development. In other words, replicate it multiple times, because there is a wide disparity in development between different parts of China. So a second thing, the respondents, the study used the key respondents approach, and said that we're using people that are highly knowledgeable about supply chain, and then went ahead and listed who they were. And I was looking at that and thinking, wow, that could certainly be improved upon. So it listed titles like CEO and president, who in a very small company are probably quite knowledgeable about supply chain, because in a small business you wear a lot of hats and you do it all. But I'm also thinking of the CEO of a very large firm may have no idea what's going on in supply chain. So I think it would be really useful to restrict the respondents to supply chain people. Another thing that we've learned over the years is that there isn't one job title that does both upstream and downstream supply chain management in a company. So you really probably would need two in each company, one responsible for upstream relationships and another one responsible for downstream relationships. I think that would really help the credibility of the results a lot, make them stronger. But taking that line of thinking one step further, we were only looking at this from the buying company's perspective. And I'm sure that'll make you laugh, Mark, but we've also spent a lot of time since then talking about how that just doesn't necessarily make sense. And I've seen this described as being like a marriage counselor just talking to one spouse about the relationship. To look at a relationship, you really need to look at both sides of the relationship. So we shouldn't just be asking the buyer, how good is your relationship with the supplier? We should also be talking to suppliers and getting their perspective on what the relationship is like. So I would definitely recommend a dyadic approach to data collection. That being said, that's very, very difficult to do. So in lieu of that, an interesting replication might be to replicate this just from the supplier's perspective. We've already got the buyer's perspective. We did that. Maybe replicate it asking suppliers. And maybe holding everything else constant that we did, but try to do it from a supplier's perspective. I think that would be an interesting replication. Probably a more obvious approach would be, we collected data just in China, which was very interesting, but looking at the same constructs and relationships in other parts of the world would be useful. So there's a lot of different ways, or a lot of different places where this could be done. And finally, the last thing is, I'm kind of a fan of limiting the number of industries that are studied in a survey study. I know most studies just send out a survey and then report back, here's all the different industries that we heard from. But I have a hard time seeing who that generalizes to, that shotgun approach. It's broad, but it may be hiding some interesting effects. So I'd like to see it replicated with a much smaller set of industries, or maybe a single industry, to really try to tease out these effects further. So those were the main things that I thought of. I think there's a lot of opportunities for, again, starting with an existing study and thinking about how it can be replicated. A good starting point is always to look at what the authors suggested at the back, where they're looking at opportunities for future research. Hopefully they did a good job of examining what they did and saying, okay, here's what we did. It's good up to a point, but there's lots of other things that could be done from there.
And this is a little unfair, but you listed a lot of things you could change, right? I mean, so the time frame is one thing, and you talked about multiple respondents at the company. You talked about really it should be dyadic, which if you had multiple respondents would be what, 4?
Yeah. Quadratic, maybe. Yeah.
Talked about splitting by industries and so on. I don't think you could do all that in one study, nor would you. I mean, certainly be incredibly resource intensive and be difficult to figure out what was going on. Of all those things, other than the change in China's economic development, which one do you think is kind of like the one you're most intrigued by?
I think the one I'm most intrigued by is having um, two respondents at the same company, one that really knows upstream supply chain management and one that really knows downstream supply chain management. I think that would really be a contribution. And yes, as you suggested, I didn't mean to imply we should do all these things in the same study. I was coming up with ideas for lots of studies. I think in a replication, it's important if you are varying things from the original study just to vary one thing so that you can really attribute cause and effect to the findings.
Or certainly vary one thing at a time. So
Yeah,
you would have to be able to parse all those things out, which becomes incredibly complicated.
yeah,
And I don't think you implied doing all those things at once. I implied that doing all those things at once would be
crazy.
extraordinarily complicated. Um, well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us about this. I appreciate you being open about how your work could be improved upon, because I know we all can be a little bit defensive about our stuff even after it's been published. And that's one of the reasons why we reached out to people to show that we all know this, but we don't all necessarily want to talk about it. And I look forward to seeing a replication of this.
Thanks, Mark. I do too.